Hello everybody, this is lesson 18 of the lecture International Economics. I will discuss slide 49 to 69 of chapter 3, Currency Politics. In this lesson I will analyze the influence of central banks on the exchange rate of their currency. Central banks are banks that have the monopoly to print the banknotes of their currencies. This monopoly provides them the power to influence the exchange rate of their currencies towards other currencies over various channels. I will discuss three such channels in this lesson. First is the direct impact of a central bank on the exchange market. Second is the impact via the interest parity channel, and third is the impact via the purchasing power parity channel. If a central bank sells own currency on the foreign exchange market, the exchange rate of its currency depreciates, as the following diagram reveals. So this is a diagram that displays the foreign exchange spot market between dollar and euro. Here we measure the exchange rate, the amount of dollars that have to be paid for 1 euro, and here we measure the trade volume. This is the supply curve and this is the demand curve. You've already derived these curves and discussed their slope. Now, what happens now on such a diagram if a central bank sells own currency? If the European Central Bank prints more euros and offers these euros on the foreign exchange market in exchange for dollar, this increases the supply of euro on the foreign exchange market, such that the euro supply curve shifts to the right. Now we have this supply curve, since the European Central Bank has increased the supply of euro by this amount. As a result of this additional supply by the European Central Bank, the intersection point between demand and supply curve falls to this lower level, which means that now the exchange rate of the euro against the dollar has depreciated. So we have a depreciation of the euro as a result. Let's now analyze what happens if the European Central Bank does the opposite and demands domestic currency on the foreign exchange market. If the European Central Bank wants to buy euro on the foreign exchange market, it needs foreign currency reserves, of course. In this case, it needs dollar. In case a central bank has no foreign currency reserves, it cannot buy its own currency on the foreign exchange market. That's an important fact. Now let's assume that the European Central Bank has enough dollar reserves to undertake such an intervention. This will increase now the demand for euro such that this curve shifts to the right. So this is the additional demand by the European Central Bank for euro, and the European Central Bank is able to do so because it has dollar reserves. The result is that the demand curve shifts upward or to the right, and now the intersection point that was initially on this level shifts to this level. This implies that we have now an increase of the exchange rate, which means the euro has appreciated against the dollar. So, an appreciation of the domestic currency is a primary effect of this central bank intervention on the foreign exchange market. This analysis shows if the central bank wants to depreciate the exchange rate of its own currency, it has to sell own currency. This is no problem, since the central bank has the monopoly to print its own currency. So it can always sell own currency. If, however, the central bank wants to appreciate the exchange rate of its own currency, it has to buy own currency. To do this, the central bank needs foreign currency reserves. Consequently, the central bank must own foreign currency directly, such as dollar reserves, or some kind of precious metal like gold or silver, which can be exchanged for the corresponding foreign currency. How does such a foreign exchange market intervention affect the remaining domestic economy? So far we have discussed only the primary effect. For the sake of simplicity, we restrict our analysis to the case of a depreciation of the euro. A depreciation of the euro makes foreign goods more expensive from the perspective of domestic consumers. They have to spend more euros for foreign currency units. Therefore, the demand for foreign goods, the import demand, will fall. On the other hand, a depreciation of the euro makes domestic goods less expensive from the perspective of foreign consumers. So they have to spend less foreign currency units for 1 unit euro. Therefore, the foreign demand for domestic goods, which is what we call export demand, will grow. So we have growth of the export demand and the decline of the import demand. This is what we can call a secondary effect of a depreciation of the domestic currency. If we combine both effects, the current account balance grows. The export gets larger, the import gets smaller, so the difference gets larger. This means the devaluation causes an increase of the total demand for domestic goods. Thus, if the central bank sells euro on the exchange market, it stimulates domestic demand for goods. In the end, the same thing happens as in the case where the central bank supplies euro to the domestic capital market as a credit. In this case, the interest rate falls, and as a result, the demand for domestic goods grows also. Both cases are therefore called expansionary monetary policy. So this was the direct impact a central bank has on its exchange rate, on the exchange rate of its currency towards other currencies via the foreign exchange market. Now let's have a look what kind of impact a central bank can have on its currency if it uses the interest parity channel. We have already derived the interest parity channel, so you know what we are talking about. So let's have a closer look how the impact via the interest parity channel works. Under the assumptions of the neoclassical as well as the Keynesian macroeconomic model, the domestic interest rate falls if the central bank increases money supply on the domestic capital market. So if money supply gets larger, now we take M, capital letter M, to measure the amount of money supplied by the central bank. If it gets larger, the interest rate falls. If nothing else happens. Now, if you take a look at the interest parity channel, this leads to depreciation of the domestic currency. Let's have a look at the formula. We can solve the formula for the spot exchange rate, and then it becomes obvious if this domestic interest rate, in this case the European interest rate, gets smaller, then this side of the equation gets smaller, and as a result this implies that the domestic spot exchange rate gets smaller too. Why is this the case? What is the economic explanation for this? This is the equation. If the equation is valid, then this reaction will be observable, but the question is why? What is the economic explanation? Now, a lower return for domestic assets causes a decrease of foreign demand for domestic assets. If foreigners demand less domestic assets to invest money, they need less domestic currency. As a consequence, the demand for domestic currency falls, so that the exchange rate depreciates. This is the explanation why we observe this. What is interesting now is that the central bank can also use the interest parity channel to appreciate the domestic currency, even if it does not own foreign currency reserves or precious metals. It simply has to reduce money supply such that total credit supply gets smaller and the interest rate, the average domestic interest rate, gets larger. If you now take a look to the interest parity equation, we observe that in such a case the European interest rate would get larger, and as a result the spot exchange rate would get larger, which means the euro appreciates in this case against the dollar. So in fact, the European Central Bank does not necessarily need dollar reserves to appreciate the domestic currency. It can simply increase the domestic interest rate. Now this sounds good, but there are potentially negative side effects of such a policy of increasing the domestic interest rate. The higher domestic interest rate can cause a reduction of domestic consumption demand and domestic investment demand. Both respond negatively to the level of the interest rate. Consumption depends negatively on the interest rate because if the interest rate gets larger, households want to undertake more savings. To do so, they have to reduce their consumption. For private companies, the interest rate represents the yearly investment costs. Hence, if the yearly investment costs get larger, the investment demand gets smaller. So, the likely side effect of such a policy is that domestic demand might shrink and hence cause a short-run recession, typical Keynesian demand-side recession. This is the problem with this type of policy. But if necessary, the central bank can do this. It only has to pay the price of this likely recession or a likely dampening of the domestic economic activity. The purchasing power parity channel is the other channel which normal monetary policy can use to influence the foreign exchange rate. The purchasing power parity channel affects the exchange rate through a change of the domestic price level. Since the domestic price level is relatively rigid in the short run, in the euro area, firms on average keep prices constant over a period of 1 year. This channel does not work in the short run, only in the long run, over time horizons larger than 1 year. The purchasing power parity channel explains why countries with expansionary monetary policy have a weak, which means depreciating, currency in the long run. Let's have a look how this channel works. As you will see, it's a little bit more complicated as the interest parity channel, since it includes the interest parity channel also. So let's start again here with an increase in the real credit supply by the domestic central bank. Real credit supply is the money supplied by the central bank divided over the price level. So real credit supply tells us how many units GDP can be bought with the amount of money the central bank prints. This fraction gets larger if the central bank prints more money and offers this additional money on the capital market. The result is, the primary effect is a decrease in the domestic market interest rate, the average domestic market interest rate. Now this causes, under normal assumptions, an increase in the domestic investment demand. As we've just discussed, there's a negative relationship between the investment credit demand and the interest rate. Additionally, we will also have an increase in domestic consumption demand, as just discussed, because consumption demand depends also negatively on the interest rate. Now, we will also have an immediate depreciation of the domestic currency via the interest parity channel. If we take a look again at the interest parity equation, we see that a reduction in the domestic interest rate causes a reduction in the domestic spot exchange rate. Now, this has an impact, as we know, on exports and import demand. Since domestic goods get cheaper at first, we will have an increase in exports. People from foreign countries will demand domestic goods because they are cheaper now. So the export demand increases. Import demand, however, decreases, since for domestic consumers or investors, domestic goods are cheaper than foreign goods. So they have less incentive to buy goods in foreign countries, and as a result, imports decrease. The difference between exports and imports is what we call net exports, and this gets larger. So we have an increase in the domestic demand for goods because all three components of the domestic demand for goods get larger. The consumption component, the investment component, plus the net export component. In other words, this type of expansionary monetary policy causes a demand side boom. So this increase in domestic demand causes excess demand. on the domestic market. Demand of goods is larger than the supply of goods. The result of this is that in the long run, prices will grow. Now the price level will start to grow. The long run, as just mentioned, is approximately 1 year. So a year after this has been started by the central bank, prices will start to grow. This increase in the domestic price level now causes a decrease in the domestic real credit supply. Initially, credit supply was increased by the central bank that offered more money, but now we have this increase of the domestic price level, which appears as a denominator of this fraction, so the fraction will get smaller again. So we are back to the initial level. The increase of prices reduces the purchasing power of the money printed by the central bank to the initial level. And this means that the interest rate will now go up again to the initial level. As a result, we will have a decrease in the demand for domestic goods. Consumption will fall, investment will fall, export will fall, and imports will rise again. The other impact of this increase of the domestic price level is that now the purchasing power parity relationship is restored again. The decrease of the exchange rate is now met by the increase of the domestic price level, such that prices measured in euro or in dollar are again identical. So we have the return of the purchasing power parity relationship, but at a lower exchange rate level. So the exchange rate stays on a lower level since the domestic price level stays on a higher level. This means we have now a new market equilibrium where the domestic price level is higher and stays on this higher level, and the domestic exchange rate against the dollar is lower and stays on this lower exchange rate level. Of course, it is also possible to use this purchasing power parity channel in the opposite direction. If the central bank increases the domestic interest rate instead of decreasing it, then it is able to reduce the domestic price level and appreciate the domestic exchange rate. So this channel works in both directions. So much for this lesson. In the next lesson we will see how central banks can use their power to fix their exchange rates within a system of fixed exchange rates.